We really have an incredible group of individuals assembled here. Some of my favorite people representing diverse parts of the ecosystem in media, but also adjacent to media, that are really going to be able to be critical for our efforts with the Media Roundtable, not just as a podcast, but actually as a movement that's trying to make an impact on the issues from polarization and some of the problems that we're seeing in this country. A few things that have been in the news lately that I think are relevant to our conversation. A lot of you probably saw that there was an Ipsos Axios poll that said that 4 out of 5 Americans agree with the statement that America is falling apart. Meanwhile, there have been the Edelman Trust Barometer came out, and trust in corporate executives and CEOs has never been higher. Trust in the media has never been lower. People still don't trust the government. So we're going to be talking about a lot of overlapping issues with these statistics. And, you know, my macro concern here personally is that America may be headed for a breakup, and there aren't enough people really working on the issue, particularly in spheres of influence like the ones where we have the fortune to work in and day out, to really try to walk that back and figure out how can we bring healing to our respective industries. So we've got some really exciting material to cover. This is our maiden voyage here with the podcast, and I'm going to do a quick introduction of our panel guests, and then we're going to start asking some questions. So first things first, we have Bob Bordone with us. Bob leads the Cambridge Negotiation Institute and is a critical founding partner with the Media Roundtable. He's also a senior fellow at Harvard Law School. Welcome, Bob. We're glad you're with us today.
Great to be here, Dan, and thanks for inviting me.
Of course, of course. In addition, we have Vanessa Otero. Vanessa is the CEO and founder of Ad Fontes Media, who created the Media Bias Chart, which, if you don't know what that is, you just haven't Googled it, because you have seen it. It's in thousands of schools across the country and really impacting people's way of understanding the biases and reliability in the media that we consume every day. Vanessa, I'm so glad you're here.
Me too. Thanks for having me.
Of course. And then we have my old friend, Shane Pitson, young man, but old friend, who also is the head of marketing at Quip, the electric toothbrush company that you might have seen running digital ads a few years ago, but today you can find them in Target and Walmart and on every kind of media you can consume. And somebody that has to really deal with these issues on the front lines every day. Welcome, Shane.
Thanks, Dan. I appreciate the opportunity to chat about this.
Glad you're here. And then we have Keith Allred, who is doing some very powerful work in Washington, D.C. He's the president of Common Sense Media and the executive director of the National Institute for Civil Discourse. It does very important work, and we've been very grateful to be able to partner with Keith and the NICD team to collaborate on these efforts. Welcome, Keith.
Good to be with you, Dan.
And then last, but more than least, probably most, none of this would be possible if it weren't for the direction and leadership of Jennifer Lane, who is our executive director of the Media Roundtable. And she is really the glue that holds this all together. Jennifer, I'm glad you're able to join us on the panel and that you're feeling better today.
Thank you. Far too generous of an introduction, but I'm very excited to be here as well.
Okay, so let's get to it. I want to hear from you guys about how what you're doing in your personal and professional lives, how that experience is motivating you to team up as a group with us here to be part of the Media Roundtable. And if you don't mind, we'll start with you, Vanessa. Do you mind being the first one to share your story about how you got mixed up in all this?
Yeah, I don't mind at all. I'd be happy to. So as you mentioned, we create the Media Bias Chart, and that's what we're known for at Ad Fontes Media. I actually created the original version back in 2016. So how we do that is, we're a company that rates the news for reliability and bias. We use politically balanced teams of analysts to rate individual articles, individual episodes for web content, podcast content, TV content. And that's how we come up with our ratings. So there's really quite a lot that goes on behind the scenes. We can talk more about that today, but in general, our mission, the whole purpose of why we do this is to make news consumers smarter and make news media better. And that's a really big, lofty type of goal. And it's not, there's not one fix to it. There are a lot of stakeholders in good news media. So we're just trying to take a big bite out of it, big chunk of it, by providing the news reliability and bias ratings. People need to understand what the media is in order to be able to do something about it. And so that's what we are for a lot of stakeholders as a baseline. And those stakeholders are consumers who need to, understand, what kind of information they're sharing, not share misinformation. Educators teaching media literacy more broadly and more effectively. Of course, the publishers and the advertisers themselves, that's a world we're going to dive into today. And then, social media companies, government, academia, all have roles to play. And so we provide products and services related to news ratings for those companies. So, this is just what I love to do and what I love to talk about, but I'll let other people chime in as well.
Well, and thank you for that context, Vanessa. And one of the reasons that not only is it great to have you, but the work that you're doing with the media bias chart is so critical is because one of our presuppositions with this whole thing is that people are very much influenced by the media that they consume. And advertisers are increasingly being held accountable and trying to lean into better stewardship of the content that they support. And you're really coming out with the first usable solution that people that really support the news financially can use to make sure that they're stewarding those dollars effectively. And so that's a critical piece of the pie with what we're doing at Media Roundtable. And I'm really glad that you're here. Bob, welcome. Do you mind sharing a little bit about the work that you do and how that's going to be fitting in the future with us?
Sure thing. And thanks again for having me, Dan. So, for more than 2 decades, I was on the faculty at Harvard Law School, where I taught negotiation and mediation and broadly courses related to what we call dispute systems design. So that is, how do organizations, ecosystems, governments set up processes to handle their differences, to handle conflict? And in the last few years, I was teaching full-time at the law school. I taught a class called the Lawyer as Facilitator, and it was really trying to address what I saw as a growing need for lawyers who are likely to be leaders to facilitate conversations across lines of difference. And in fact, my last year teaching, I taught a class called Political Dialogue in Polarizing Times. And one of the observations that I saw in that work was students who were actively signing up for these classes and yet at a complete loss to how to actually engage differences constructively. So you would spend a bunch of time doing training and then you'd put them in the room to facilitate, and they would do everything they could to avoid getting into the hardest and most divisive issues. And so I left Harvard Law School a few years ago to start the Cambridge Negotiation Institute. Certainly with the idea of continuing to do work in negotiation and mediation, but with a real interest in looking for opportunities. And this is one that seems really spot on for me, where there is a real need for people who have strongly held differences that are incredibly often, very emotional, to actually have conversations rather than either A, avoid, or B, go immediately to, take no prisoners kind of warfare. I would say, just as a personal part of this, but it certainly connects into this work, since I was, I would say 7 years old, I've been a politics nerd and a media nerd. I grew up with my life hero being Dan Rather. He is still one of my life heroes. But so the opportunity really to do work in an ecosystem that has changed enormously, but still is of such critical importance to any citizens who care about democracy. It just seems pretty exciting to me.
Well, Bob, I'm so glad that you're with us because, we're with the Media Roundtable, we're trying to create some off-the-shelf resources, and there's some kind of DIY opportunities. Like if you have the media bias chart, you can make more informed decisions. But one of the problems that a lot of companies have is that they're trying to balance their business objectives with their corporate values. And that can be a real struggle to carry that out. And sometimes it isn't as simple as, yeah, we're going to pick that and not pick that. Sometimes somebody has to get into the trenches and really work through problems, which is what we're trying to guide people to do. And so to be partnered with the Cambridge Negotiation Institute and yourself, it's great that the people that are trying to use our resources have a resource that can advocate for them on a level that usually they wouldn't even know is possible, because they feel like they have to go it alone when they have conflict with their suppliers in the media who they buy from to try to get an outcome. So thank you for being here. We're really excited to have you.
I'm thrilled to be here too.
Shane, it is so good to see you. Tell us about the work you do and how that connects back to what we're doing with Media Roundtable.
Yeah, you were just mentioning that there's many on the corporate side in the trenches trying to work through this. I'm a marketing professional, and over the last 5 or 6 years have been spent focused on trying to market a product that is applicable to a very unified or broad audience, which is everyone with a mouth. Through that time period, I've just been able to observe the kind of growing increase, or the increase in publishers and people entering the media ecosystem, and ultimately discourse and opinion becoming increasingly divisive and hard to navigate as an advertiser. And I think earlier you mentioned, executives being more trusted, and I think it's in part because brands and the executives that make decisions at those brands have taken on more of a responsibility to be more vocal and to be more involved in that discourse, no longer kind of pleading the fifth when there's kind of broader societal topics, and their customers expect brands to have that opinion and voice. And so, I look forward to kind of working with more brands and advertisers that are trying to understand how to navigate the space while having an opinion and voice themselves. And then, personally, I've just, been at Zoom Thanksgiving tables like many of us this year, and I think I've witnessed many people having increasing difficulty in understanding media sources and reliability and just general media literacy, and I think it's something that a group like this can really help to address.
Well, what you represent is so important, and it is brave that you are a part of this, because I think everybody is most people are on one side or the other, either complaining about misinformation or they're calling it fake news, but everybody's kind of saying the same thing. And what people don't usually realize or stop to consider is that somebody's paying for that information. Somebody is making that possible. And as we just saw the Business Roundtable come up with, I think, 60 different initiatives that they're actually going to report their metrics on. Supply chain is important. And if you think of media in those terms, this is critical because you really hold all the chips, as do your peers in the marketing community. So thank you for being brave and stepping up with us to show how your impact can be positive and not just one of pure avoidance of challenges. So thank you and welcome.
Thank you.
Keith, the great Keith Allred. Tell us about your world and how this all ties together.
Yeah, well, I'm a little bit like Bob. I'm a recovering academic. I was teaching similar courses at the Kennedy School early on when Bob was teaching at the law school. And I'm now executive director at the National Institute for Civil Discourse. And our work is really about building our capacity as a country to engage our differences more constructively. And so we have a variety of programs for doing that. We have an Engaging Differences program where we provide kind of principles and best practices and resources so people can kind of figure out, the how do I engage those differences more constructively. We have another flagship program that you mentioned called Common Sense American that now has over 24,000 members from across the country and political spectrum. And we work on a couple of issues per year to identify solutions that are wise enough to attract broad support and then champion those in the Congress. We're pretty delighted. The first issue we took on was surprise medical billing, and Congress passed an end to surprise medical billing in December with some pretty meaningful involvement on our part. So we're 1 for 1 so far on issues, in spite of all the polarization. But as we look out broadly at NICD, at this landscape in a more polarizing, bitter country, and looking for where's the leverage, where's some oomph that we could really move the needle on it. Clearly, the news media ecosystem and the brands and the marketers is just where there really is an opportunity for real influence, as we've discussed. So the Shanes of the world, could really make a difference. And so, we've been awfully excited to partner with you, Dan, and the others and Oxford Road to get engaged with Media Roundtable to help think through what are the kind of resources and structures we could provide so that marketers, brands, media outlets might be part of the solution. So we're really excited about it, Dan.
Well, I'm so glad to be in partnership with you and with NICD because, they say politics is downstream from culture, right? And so as we're trying to work on the cultural piece, it's great to see that there's a through line into real action and actually boots on the ground collaboration happening. That's going to make a direct impact on people. So thank you for the work, and we're glad that you're here. And then, of course, none of us could do any of this if somebody wasn't really running the program here with Media Roundtable, and that, of course, is because of our Executive Director Jennifer Lane. So, Jennifer, welcome. Can you share a little bit with us about how you got into this mess and why it's important to you?
As the person who's personally responsible for pulling me into this mess, I have actually worked with Dan on a number of different roles throughout the course of my career, and most recently as a content creator. So being on the other side of putting content out and seeing the clicks that come through when you get increasingly hostile, it was something that became unavoidable to pay attention to. And so in my most recent role, working directly with Oxford Road and seeing the other side of performance related to sort of vicious or polarizing media, it felt like a necessary next step to really put some of these words and the general public's thoughts into action and try to find a different path forward that would create a healthier solution for listeners around the country. And I mean, speaking to the personal side, as others already have, having family and friends on both sides of the divide, I think it becomes increasingly difficult to watch relationships sort of go south. And if we're able to do anything in our power to keep that from happening in the future, whether friends, colleagues, or family, I think it's our responsibility to dive in and become part of the solution.
Well, thank you. And like I said, it's if there were no infrastructure, we couldn't do any of this. So thank you for your leadership to get us here. So, okay. I'd love to ask for a few of you to chime in on this next topic, which is how are you seeing our current polarization play out in your real experience? Like, what is the today's state, and how are you experiencing it personally and professionally to the extent that you can share? Does anybody mind taking a crack at that one?
Yeah, and I don't mind going on that one. The whole reason I started my company was because of the polarization and realizing that people would fight with each other online and do so badly and unconvincingly by just posting an article to some like really polarized news source that the other side would just completely dismiss out of hand. They'd say, "I am right. Look at this article from Breitbart," and somebody said, "Well, I'm right. Look at this article from HuffPost," right? So they just, talk past each other. Those things were not convincing to the other side. And so I thought, to make it easier to discuss on social media with my friends, I'm a news nerd. We have that nerd commonality in the background. I'm actually also a lawyer myself. Been a patent attorney for 6 years. So as a hobby, I made a map of the media, right? I also call all of my, people on our email list who follow us closely news nerds as well, very affectionately, because we care about these issues. So, there are sources that are more reliable and less reliable, sources that are more biased left and right. So made a map. But what I noticed is that, people live in these, this conversation has come up before: filter bubbles, silos, people being separated. Like the thing a lot of us have in common is that we have people that we're trying to bridge divides with, and we have these structures for having conversations with people that we don't agree with politically. But most people right now are just driven into the exact opposite of that. So if it's online, it's, your Facebook newsfeed, filter bubble, all the people that agree with you. And since media is so fragmented and there are so many different options now, it's really easy to wall yourself off. And imagine just listening to only like really left-leaning or really right-leaning podcasts all day, just like piping that information into your ears just from one side. So across all media, TV and web, people only experience, for the most part, the media that they love and consume and agree with, and there's only so much they can consume. So that leads to the divides, and why we like get further and further away from even being able to see why someone else would even think like they do. It just is like so foreign to people. And even if we think we know what's on the other side, we don't. Usually people experience the media of the other side as like a caricature filtered through somebody that on their side. Like a left-leaning person will follow another left-leaning person on Twitter, or like a comedian that points out, "Oh, look at this stupid thing that they said on Fox News." And on the right, they'll similarly they'll say follow this right-leaning person on Twitter. Says, "Oh, look at this terrible article that they posted on Slate. Can you believe it?" And then that's how everybody thinks the other side is just ridiculous. That's how I experience it.
Yeah,
That's
I mean, if I could jump in there, I think a lot of that kind of talking past each other, or like, throwing different articles or sources or references that might not kind of hit home in the right way. I think as an advertiser, there's definitely been multiple kind of movements around like media activism, and different organizations that have sought to kind of identify and call out and help kind of brands to recognize or to be more aware of where their advertisements are showing up, and making sure that they're doing so in a conscious manner, and kind of are aware of that media pipeline that we had referenced earlier. As an advertiser, I think that can ultimately not be the most constructive way to go about creating a better media ecosystem. If it's purely destructive in the sense of let's try and demonetize or kind of remove advertising altogether, you can also ultimately end up missing out on supporting the beautiful side of content being more accessible, and being able to have a voice and an opinion in supporting, you know, people that are doing really interesting and unique reporting and shows and content that's helped to power the ecosystem on that side. So
hey Shane, can you talk a little bit more about what it's like as an advertiser when your brand is placed somewhere that may be controversial? Like, what happens in real life?
I think ultimately there will be, to varying degrees, like, you know, a lot of interaction generally on Twitter at first, or, you know, within social, or, you know, emails to the company inbox. But it can often kind of be difficult to discern the context. You know, I think it's important to be able to, you know, step back and, you know, kind of step away from like pure sound bites and try and look at stories and information and controversy within a broader set of context. You know, who is the audience that is upset, and, you know, are they rightfully, you know, upset? Is this a difference of opinion, or is this, you know, something that, you know, was clearly inflammatory or inciting to violence, or you know, something of that nature? And I think that you know, as a brand, you have to kind of take a step back from your day-to-day of trying to grow a business to then try and understand the context in which you're now involved.
Yeah, can I just say something?
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's really interesting, Shane. You know, one way of thinking about the role that you would play as an advertiser, right, is to take this step back. And almost what I hear you talking about is kind of doing an assessment of the merits of those complaints, right? You know, how bad was it? Who's right or who's wrong, right? And and then what should we do about it? And it's interesting, like another way of thinking about that. So in the law, we talk about an opportunity to be heard, right? So going to court, right, is because you want an opportunity to be heard. And in fact, when courts begin, typically a clerk will say, "Come, you know, all having business before the Honorable Dan Granger shall come forward, hearken, and be heard." Like, that's the line. And another way of thinking about what's happening is there's this moment where someone has said something that feels wrong, hurtful, upsetting, offensive, fill in the blank. And someone on the other side is looking to be heard. And they don't think they're going to get a hearing from the person who said it. But so they're going to a third party, which is the advertiser. And the advertiser doing the thing that the set of complainants want is their way of feeling heard. But the question would be, is there another way that you can make those people feel heard, right? Because, and thinking about what you were saying, Vanessa, too, right? It's kind of like, I'm going to show you a news article and I'm going to show you another, and I'll double down with two more. And so it's point, counterpoint, with no hearing, right, at all.
Absolutely.
And so I think part of like what's embedded here, right, and this is not meant to be touchy-feely or put aside the genuine differences and strongly held emotions and feelings that people have about it. But part of what is not happening in the space that I think could be really valuable is, where is the hearing, which is totally different from agreeing, which is totally different from conceding, which is totally different from winning and losing. So anyway, maybe that's more. But more than you wanted to hear.
Don't disclaim, Bob. That is, I think you just solved all our problems, actually. Now the only question is, how do we execute? By the way, first time that the Honorable and Dan Granger have been used in a sentence before, so thank you.
Well, you always can do a career pivot if you want it.
Yeah, right. I don't think so. Keith, how about you?
Yeah, following up on Bob's comments a little bit, we often say at NICD that listening is the first principle and best practice of engaging differences constructively. And so, people are going to be pushing in the ways Bob suggested to give a chance to, have voice and be heard. And then there's the question of, are we doing something so that we're actually listening to it and being heard? And one of the best things you can do just at a one-on-one level to turn a cycle around is really try to listen for understanding. So I certainly echo that. I might shift just a little bit on this, question of, polarization, the current state of polarization, and how do you experience it? I might just shift a little bit to a view of the Congress, where a lot of our attention is focused and where it's so consequential that we have polarization. So, I'm a recovering academic, but I relapse every now and then. So a quick relapse on you, a little data. So there are a couple of political scientists that have figured out a way of analyzing the more than 13 million roll call votes that have been cast since 1789 when we started under the Congress. And that shows that in 2016, we broke the record for the most party line voting ever in that 230 years. And it's a 40-year trend line and continues to go up. So we have been seeing more and more congressional polarization, more and more party line voting, more than ever before. So we've had deeper conflicts and disputes in this country before. We had a civil war, the civil rights and Vietnam era arguably had deeper divisions, but they didn't break cleanly along partisan lines. What's unique about this period in American history is how deep the partisan polarization is, the left-right politically. And so that's, kind of the bad news base rate on Congress. Just to pile on to that kind of nerdy historical data, just in the last couple of weeks, we engage quite a bit with Congress through Common Sense American. I'll just give you a little bit of a feel. I mean, we're seeing this on our cable news every night, but just to give you a little bit of a feel, what you get a little bit behind closed doors, a feel. I was talking to one staffer just this last week who knows and supports some of the most bipartisan members of the House that we know, who are real bipartisan champions. And they said that right now, she's seeing bipartisan champions, seeing somebody from the other side coming down the hall and turning and going somewhere else so they don't have to say hi to each other. She said she's had 30 years of experience on Capitol Hill. She said she's never seen it remotely close to what it is right now. So it has gotten, just in the last couple of weeks, since January 6th, it has really gone to historically disturbing levels. So that's on the bad side of how we experience polarization in the Congress at NICD. Let me a little bit of a note of hope, though. As tough as that is, there are some signs of hope. A 50-50 Senate and one of the most closely divided houses in American history does create a kind of imperative that you're just not going to get anything done if you can't work across the aisle. And there's a group of 16 in the Senate, going by different names, the Common Sense Coalition or the Gang of 16, 8 Republicans and 8 Democrats who are meeting pretty frequently and really standing up. They have developed quite good working relationships and are really trying to bridge that divide. And given a Biden administration that's pledged to govern by unifying, and a group like that in the Senate, there are a couple of groups in the House, the Problem Solvers Caucus, the Bipartisan Working Group. If those folks really step up, we've got some real hope. But there's also real peril that things could get a lot worse, I think, in the time coming. So just the view from inside Congress there.
Yeah, I think that's a helpful perspective. What happens, though, if we keep going down this path where you've got incentive structures that reward attention before collaboration, and everybody's got their own media channel, several of them, and some are losing some of those channels now, which may have its own problems. But what do you do when everybody's has access to be heard, and nobody is incentivized to listen, and we're more fragmented than we've ever been, and yet keep getting pulled further and further toward the fringes of both sides. Where does this go if it doesn't get resolved?
Yeah, Dan, I might,
doesn't
it's
change?
all right, I'll take a crack and kind of continue on that congressional line, and then we can kind of broaden it out. But you talked about the incentives and limits that people face, and at the core, that's fundamentally one of the problems, is that politicians are winning elections by doing this, right? They raise money, they can get a lot of attention on their Twitter feed, they get a lot of coverage in the news media if they're throwing flames. And as the two parties have sorted themselves ideologically, most members of Congress are more worried about their base in the primary than they are in the general election. So they're playing to those extremes, and the way to be successful there is to just really hammer the other side. So there is this kind of structural incentives piece that is really tough and is going to be with us for a while. And so then the question is, what do you do about it? I think one thing is that, we as citizens and voters have got to recognize that you got to turn out and vote in the primary elections, not just in the general, because that's where a lot of this is happening. That Congress is getting more extreme. But it's also a stepping up and engaging our elected officials directly, getting good information, doing the kind of checking, the kind of sources that Vanessa provides to say, hey, can I get good information, getting informed, and then engaging our policymakers in a little more balanced way. That's what we do at Common Sense Americans. You have a chance to really get informed on an issue and then engage with your members of Congress in a little more substantive, less food fighting way.
Okay. Who else has a thought on what's at stake here? How this could actually get worse if uncontained?
Well, I don't know that it can always get worse, right? But I think we should recognize the fact that it's already extremely bad. Like, we are experiencing these consequences. We are living in this, and we don't need to identify a future rock bottom. Like, this is pretty much it. We had I don't think we've even reckoned with the fact that coronavirus misinformation and the politicization and polarization of the coronavirus has caused over 400,000 people to die. I mean, the direct link between misinformation and death here, I think we're glossing over as a society. Like, people won't wear masks because it's political. People will just not social distance because it's political, right? They'll spread information like this is not as bad as the flu. Or it's just like the flu. People don't really say that much anymore, but at the beginning they did, right? They had bad information, didn't know how to discern information. We see people's relationships breaking down with their family. I mean, I get tons of stories all the time, people telling me, I literally lost a family member to conspiracy theory rabbit hole. And they don't even know how to communicate with that person. They can't even reach them. They're at a loss, right? So this breakdown in family and societal relationships is a huge impact. And then real life violence spilling out from these polarized filter bubbles into the streets. It happened with Pizzagate, other protests. It culminated in an insurrection at the Capitol where people tried to violently overthrow our government. This is how bad it can be, what we're living right now. So, I am very much interested in turning immediately to the question of what do we do about it? And I think we've got enough studies. I think we've got enough evidence. I think we know what the problem is.
Well, they say you got to get sick and tired of getting sick and tired. So do you think that the pain is already at the maximum to see the type of turn that we need to see in society to make the changes? You think the pain is already there? Are people ready to move on this?
Yeah, I mean, the noise around this discourse, this conversation about brands need to do something, all the stakeholders need to do something, that has gotten louder and louder and louder. It will continue to do so, and that's a good thing. More people are paying attention to this conversation than ever before. So yeah, now's the time to act.
Yeah,
I mean,
I
I hope Vanessa's, go ahead, Keith.
yeah, I might just chime in on that line with Vanessa that I had a saying for the last 2 years or so that I'm swearing off, where I've said, just when we think our politics can get no worse, we find a new bottom. And I feel like I'm just tempting fate. I'm like, I need to quit saying that, because we keep, crushing through to new bottoms. And I kind of agree with Vanessa. Man, if this isn't bad enough to get us off our duffs and doing something about it, what is it going to take? So I agree with that. And I do agree that as a country, we kind of have a tendency, I think, that we don't get serious about solving a problem until it's really a crisis. And I do think that we're getting there. I mean, the fact of the launch of Media Matters, I think, speaks to that, and how much people are involved. With Common Sense American, we're attracting members at 3.5 times the speed that we expected to. And for all the advertisers out there, 1/8 the advertising costs that we expected to. We do social media advertising to recruit those. So I think that there is a spiking kind of concern to motivate us to get us off the duff. And I think that we'd better not wait very long if we're going to try to turn this thing around.
Yeah, I mean, I guess what I would say, right? I mean, I agree with everything that both Vanessa and Keith said insofar as how bad things are, although I'm not sure that there's not record bottoms to come. And I hope that's not the case, but I think part of what makes me worry about this is a way in which the costs of this moment, I think, are not being equally or nearly equally felt. And so that there are a set of people who feel like we've reached rock bottom, right? And things really need to change. And that may be even a growing number of people. On the other hand, I think there are still a sizable number of people who are benefiting from the mayhem, or think that continued mayhem will benefit them, and think that other people are overplaying, whether it's COVID or insurrection or fill in the blank, right? This is being overplayed. And in our field, in the kind of negotiation dispute resolution field, we sometimes talk about a concept called mutual hurting stalemate, HURTING. Mutual hurting stalemate sometimes is the invitation to changing. But that means that everyone involved has to feel like we've hit a hurting stalemate. Not everyone, but enough people. And I worry that we're not there. I worry that, which doesn't mean that there's not good reason to hope, and there doesn't mean there's not good work to be done. Doesn't mean that let's all just sit here and wait for it to get to that point, as the cities burn. But to me, I guess I would just say it's not inevitable that without the work of the people like the other people on this podcast, right, and people who are willing to be courageous and take a step in whatever their field is, to do something that is outside of expectation, that puts themselves at some risk, whether that's professional risk or personal risk, that's willing to engage their 2 ears before their one mouth, that without those things happening, I don't think it's necessarily the case that we've reached rock bottom, which is not what Vanessa or Keith said either. But I think that this will require a lot of work and a lot of listening and a lot of helping people find a way to express their viewpoints and their way they see the world, and also be open to others, not see that as kind of an existential threat or an identity threat.
Yeah, if I could add to that, Bob, I think it's first I've heard of that mutually hurting stalemate concept, but I think it makes a lot of sense, and I think there's been a lot of organizations that have done a good job of trying to remove incentives, for those that maybe have been benefiting from this type of this organization or mayhem, as you mentioned. But I haven't seen enough, I think, benefits or incentives to improve, right? I think it's, we've been a little bit more quick to identify where to kind of remove incentives within the ecosystem. But I think there's a real opportunity to help kind of identify people that are looking to bring people together and find incentives for media that does that.
Yeah, if I could just continue a little bit on Shane's thought there, you know, a hurting stalemate can be the impetus for resolution, but sometimes human beings react to long endured pain with a kind of learned helplessness. They kind of throw up their hands. And I think that especially right now, it looks frightening to get into the fray and do something about it, right? It's like people are getting burned doing that. I don't want to step up and do that. And so, you know, Common Sense American for Everyday Citizens, it was trying to find an easy and safe way for people to get engaged. And I think that's part of what Media Matters is really important, is they don't, you know, if I were an advertiser, a brand right now, I'd just be like, gosh, I just don't want to move anywhere. You know, I'm just going to get hammered whatever I do. And so I really think it's useful, this Media Matters effort.
Keith, I'm going to pause you and ask you to pick that statement up, because remember, Media Roundtable, Media Matters is an attack.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, that's a different approach than we're taking.
Yeah, sorry. And I'm gonna come back on you. You introduced me as president of Common Sense Media, which is also another thing.
Oh no! All right, I can fix that. All right, noted.
So
what's really
even.
funny is as you were talking, I was like, I better look up what Media Matters is. Like, I have my other screen here. I'm like reading it.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. Sorry. So let me
drop any other revisions into the chat. I'll make sure we pick them up.
Good. So can I just take that one again, and
please,
I'll say
please, yeah.
Yeah. Just following up on Bob's point, you know, a hurting stalemate can be the impetus for change and getting us to solve things, and that's certainly documented a lot. But humans sometimes also react to, you know, enduring pain by kind of learned helplessness and giving up. And I sure see a lot of that right now around the political polarization, right? It's frightening. You say, man, I see people who wade in and they just get fried. I don't want to touch that right now. That was one of our efforts with Common Sense American, just for everyday citizens, is to give people a safe and productive way of engaging to make a difference. And I think that's much of what Media Roundtable offers and is so important. I mean, if I were a brand or an advertiser right now, I'd be just really frightened, and I think I could feel a little frozen. Like I don't want to move or do anything one way. Just whatever I do feels like it's going to backfire. And so, you know, we need to develop a broader set of options, of resources, of tools of what do we do, and be able to point to directions of alternatives of, yeah, okay, I'm concerned. I'd like to be part of the solution, but I need a little help on, you know, I'm motivated, but I need a little help on how do I do that effectively. And I think that's just a critical role for Media Roundtable.
So let me ask you guys a question. When we talk about the future and the hope that we have, and I want to get into that future state a little more, but before we can, is unity really a viable goal at this stage, or is that too big an ask right now? Do we just need people to be a little more accepting of disagreement before we can even talk about unity?
I'll jump in for just a minute. I think this is a really interesting question, and there's so much focus on unity right now. And at the end of the day, I think that is a North Star, but I don't think it's necessarily achievable, because at the end of we all live in a democracy, and the joy of a democracy is varied opinion and varied perspective and heated debate, and all of these things are iron that sharpens iron that makes us stronger. And so I don't think unity as an end result is necessarily what we're all after, because then you can argue that we would, then we're not continually growing and we're not pushing ourselves. And so I think having varied voices is really important. And the goal would be having civil discourse, and it would be respectful disagreement, and it would be trying to understand rather than be the same.
Yeah, I mean,
go ahead, Bob.
Yeah, I would just say that, I mean, for me, a lot of it depends on what do you mean by unity. But it seems like that it is essential for a nation state to remain a nation state, that there be some shared bedrock principles, understandings that guide the way we interact with each other, the way we make decisions, what it means to live in an ordered society, what it means to live in a democracy. That I think is essential, and I think is attainable, and I think still exists to some point, although I see that on the decline. And then within that, though, right, I think it is then, how do we manage our differences? And in fact, you know, part of what I would say is that there is this idea sometimes that if there is, like, conflict is bad, conflict is a sign of weakness, conflict is a sign of something has gone wrong. And I would just disagree with all of that, right? Conflict is part of how humans who are with each other interact, right? It is necessary. It is not a sign of badness. It is a sign of normalcy. It is a sign of vibrancy. But how we handle those conflicts, how we talk about them, when we can resolve them and when we cannot resolve them, how we manage them, and still kind of live with each other, seeing each other as kind of fully human and fully integrated and kind of worthy, right? That is the mark of what would make us a kind of rich, strong, and secure nation. Not the elimination of conflict, not the elimination of difference. And so that goes to both building individual capacity to do that. I think it goes to shifting how people think of conflict, and then also building institutional capacity, organizational capacity for that.
Yeah, I think to your point, the conflict can be healthy conflict, but I think where we've gotten into a bit of trouble is kind of in my mind a lack of like situational awareness, or like a lack of kind of where many find themselves, and kind of understanding how they might be perceived by the other side. And I think it kind of goes back to that earlier comment of like, you know, I'll match a Breitbart article with a HuffPost article without really thinking about, okay, well, how is the other side going to perceive that this is the source from which I'm sharing this information? And I think, you know, the work that Vanessa is doing with Ad Fontes and the media bias chart, like, I think understanding bias in a more clear way, understanding like fact checking and you know, working with schools and kind of increasing media literacy, and aggregators that help to identify blind spots like ground news and all sides. Like, I think all of those things will help people to have a bit more situational awareness to hopefully engage in that conflict a little bit more constructively by trying to, you know, communicate via, you know, the best argument from the other side, or what they might respond best to.
I have a question for you, Bob, in regards to healthy conflict. With so many outlets just being one-way conversations, it feels like conflict is actually it's a missed opportunity. Everyone is in conflict with each other, but again, no one is talking about it. So how can you actually engage in healthy conflict when everyone has a platform and has a voice, but no one is looking into anyone else's eyes or is having to have an actual conversation one-on-one?
I mean, this is a great and rich question, right? Which is what does it mean in a world of kind of the social media world, this Twitter world, to actually engage dialogue in some kind of meaningful way, right? And I'm not sure I have great answer to that question. I do think, though, that it's a space for some kind of creative thinking around this, right? So I'll give you an example. I do a lot of work with an organization called Seeds of Peace. Seeds of Peace brings together Israeli and Palestinian young people for kind of 3 weeks of intensive dialogue at a summer camp up in the state of Maine. And I mean, these are people who actually feel, an existential threat from the people on the other side, right? Not anything less than that. And it's a fairly transformative experience, blah, 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 right? But then here's the challenge, right? People go back home, and because of restrictions around the way Palestinians can travel in Israel and the ability of Israelis to actually cannot really travel into the occupied territories or the West Bank, these people don't have a way of connecting except through things like Facebook. And then what happens when something happens in the world and someone posts something on Facebook, and now you have people who had this lived experience of being with each other for 3 weeks, but all we have left is Facebook. And there's structural things you could do. So for example, setting up some private spaces so that it's not anything I post all of my friends can see, but private spaces that only people who've been involved in this program can actually see the dialogues, or requiring something like, we want you to absolutely make your comments, but do it as a video. The requirement to do it as a video actually slows people's thinking down, even though they're not actually looking at their peers, they're looking at a camera and they're realizing they're going to be seen in a different way. So I guess the question is, now, you can't institute that on Twitter. I get that. And in a podcast, there's the podcaster and then there's all the listeners. But I think if you get people like at least willing to think about, are there some structural kinds of things we can build in that we can agree to, that might slow things down, that might cause a bit more thoughtfulness. I think that could be useful, and I think there's a market for it, right? I mean, just thinking about, because a lot of this is driven by not just our ideas of citizenship or our ideas of like what's the right thing to do, but also by like what people will pay for or listen to. I think there's space for that, but it's a great question, Jennifer, and I'd love to hear others' thoughts on it. That really hard question.
Well, and let me focus it a little bit more down the path you're going, Bob, which is, look, I think we're all realists here that we're not going to get to some kumbaya state in the next, in the immediate future, right? But in the next few years, next 2-3 years, what does a future look like in an optimistic view if we can work with people in the marketplace and other efforts that are working in parallel, really decide to engage this issue? What does that look like potentially, and what other thoughts do you have about how to get there?
Well, I think what it looks like is, marketers and publishers like working toward, like actually taking concrete steps towards this goal. I talk to a lot of people in the marketing world, and the thing that we've been promoting, and that's a big centerpiece of the Media Roundtable, is this idea of promoting good journalism and defunding junk news. Polarizing junk news is what we refer to it as. And when I talk to marketers and when I talk to publishers, I get this sense that, wow, that's a great idea and that is so aspirational, but I know that in my industry, so much is driven by ROI and money. I would do it, but I just don't know if everyone else would do it. However, like 100% of the people that I talk to say they want to do that, right? So, everyone thinks that they're the only one in this world that wants to take action and move in this direction. They're not, right? Sure, there are some people who want to, like, they just only care about money, right? But we don't even really know what the percentages of those people are. Say there's just the people who only care about money, they'll advertise on whatever, they'll take their, don't mind if there's bad actors, and they'll take advantage of whatever advantage they can gain. Then there's people who would like do the right thing, if they could kind of balance out the the good and the bad. And then there's people who would are very principled and would say, you know what, I'm going to take bold action to put my marketing dollars towards towards good journalism and away from junk news. So maybe that's like a third, a third, a third. If you have a third of marketers saying, or 2/3, either I'm going to take bold action and put my money where my mouth is, where my brand says it is, about the things that I care about, good journalism, not in junk news. And if you have another third that are willing to say, I'll move in this direction as long as I don't have to rock the boat too much, that's 2/3 of the audience that can make a huge positive, powerful difference, right? Instead of people just sitting on their hands saying, well, this is how the way it is, everybody else won't do it, right? So this Media Roundtable is really crucial in getting that point across. Look at all these other people who are willing to do it with you. Let's hold hands and do it together.
I think it's an interesting top-down, bottom-up question too. And I think what you're saying makes a lot of sense from the top down. But if you look at the demand for junk news and volatile news from the bottom up, there are a good portion of America wants this to continue on. It's where they're spending their time. It's what's getting their impressions. And I think the work we're doing is really important from our perspective of brands and marketers and content creators and networks and platforms. But how can we begin to also work from the bottom up and have the demand lessen for this type of content?
I liken it to the junk news and junk food analogy that if you've heard me talk, I talk about this all the time. It was kind of the existential crisis of fast food and processed food manufacturers. Well, the people just want the stuff that's bad for them. They want the fat, salt, and sugar, so we have to give it to them, right? But both kind of stakeholders have to change, right? The consumers have to change. And when would the consumers change and realize, I need to eat healthier. I need to not just eat junk food. It's when they realize it's personally bad for them, right? I mean, cable news and a lot of podcasts are like the donuts and fries of, the nutritional table. It's like they're food and they won't kill you and you can live off them. But if you just sit and consume them all day, they're bad for you, right? So if people realize the deleterious effect that their media diets have on their relationships with family, their ability to function in society, their job prospects, all of those things, then there will be less demand. But I think awareness, consumer awareness of whether certain media diets are better or worse for them personally is a big key to this.
Here's one thought as maybe the least media savvy person on the podcast here, take it with a grain of salt. But Vanessa, I wonder if it would be useful to have an advertiser's bias chart, right? Can we give some incentives and some kudos to advertisers who are trying to do, balanced or, promote shows? I don't know if that's helpful or not, but maybe, Dan, we've kind of talked about, signing on with Media Roundtable as being kind of a good housekeeping seal of approval. And maybe there could be a chart of, how well advertisers do that. Don't know that would work.
It's a great idea. It will cost some friendships, but it's a really good idea. One thing that's funny is, it's not funny, it's actually tragic, but I think what Vanessa was articulating earlier is really true. I think when I engage with the advertising community, I find pockets that are 10 to 20% of advertisers are we don't care if it works. We're numbers. And then 15 to 20% on the other side are purist. We don't need to see the performance metrics. We're going to put our money in what we believe in. And then everybody else is in between, right? But the bigger problem is when, the fact is we're all, a lot of people vote, a lot of people have political opinions. And when I talk to people, and I imagine you guys have a similar experience, everybody sees change that needs to happen as long as it comes from people that aren't like them, as long as it's the other side. The left, when I talk to my friends on the far left, they are confident that all of this can be changed and we can come together as a country so long as the far right changes or the whole right changes And the converse is the exact same thing. When I talk to my dear friends on the right, it's the Democrats that are the problem. So is one of them right at all? Is one side more right than the other and we just need to manage one side? Or is there culpability on both ends and at an equal level?
You know, a little like Bob, I've spent thousands of hours as a mediator. And one thing I've noticed about the turning point, if you reach a turning point and you go from a vicious cycle of contention and suspicion to a virtuous cycle of cooperation and trust, one of the keys to the inflection point is people quit focusing exclusively on the other side's contribution to the problem, like you're talking about, Dan, and they'll own at least some of the problem and focus on doing that. And I've usually not found it all that productive in those situations to get into a very careful balancing of the percentage allocation of blame for the problem. You know, is it 70, 30? Is it, you know, and for the, sometimes I think you do have to get into that, but mostly I find that not counterproductive. I find it counterproductive. And I've often said, look, as long as it's at least each side has at least 10% of the responsibility for things going bad, it's going to tend to be more productive to focus on, if you think you're only 10% of the problem, focus a little bit more on that and doing your part and leave it to the other side to correct the others, is usually where that turns around. I will confess that's a much easier to achieve, that kind of turnaround where you have a kind of smaller group than a country of 300 million people, right? And you can start to build a little trust for that and a few things. It's hard, you know, in part because people are in a defensive crouch, that they don't feel like they want to do that they're going to sort of compromise their own position that way. I think that's a misguided view. I don't think it's actually that way, but people have that mindset of being in a hunker mentality. But I think you're right that it to me, there is culpability on both sides, and it doesn't have to be 50-50. You know, if it's 51-49, then it doesn't have to be exactly equally balanced for it to be productive for each of us to start thinking a little bit more about our own side's contribution and what we can do differently.
Yeah, and I think,
And yeah,
oh, sorry about.
I'll just say, no, I was just going to pick up. I mean, this is a subtle thing that maybe only I noticed, but I think it's worth saying, right? The shift in the word from culpability to contribution that Keith made is kind of an important one, because whenever there's this thing called blame or culpability or fault that needs to get allocated, like nobody wants to take that on ever. And the language shift to kind of thinking about contribution, like what are the things that each of us may have done or failed to do that may have contributed to where we are now, is, I think, a somewhat easier thing, and takes away, I mean, this is kind of going back to the conversation that I mentioned earlier with Shane, right? Takes away the role. There's an adjudication. There are, the guilty and the innocent, the victim, and the perpetrator. And I guess just one more thing, and then just to listen, to kind of hear Shane's thoughts on this. I think that part of what can makes this kind of moment maybe a little bit easier for someone who comes from a mediation perspective is that and this moment, I think maybe more than most, is like proving a mediator's point, which is that facts have little to do with conflict. And this is a moment, as Vanessa was saying earlier, right? 400,000 people are dead, right? Like there is COVID, there's like all these things happening. And then you have some people saying these things aren't happening. And I'm thinking like, I don't think facts are going to win the day here. I think if this is about narrative and story, And most people's story of themselves are as good and decent people who are doing their best in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And if we can like step into that, and if we can't do that at the grandest political level, if we can even just do that with the family member who we think used to be sane, but now we think is insane, right? If we could at least say like their story of themselves can't be one of insanity. And I've known them for 35 years. Like, I don't know what's happened, but they're not insane. That like opens up some space to do something different. So sorry, I've overspoken. Sorry, Shane.
No, not at all. I think it's really compelling visuals that at least resonate for me personally. But I think what I was going to say, piggybacking off of Dan's comment about, is one side, more to blame, essentially, is I think it's maybe more helpful for me at least to kind of think about it more about leadership, and then as us as citizens or individuals. And I think leadership has an opportunity, whether that be executives at brands and in terms of deciding how to allocate their advertising budgets, or as Congress, and our elected officials kind of choosing which content creators and which content to broadcast to their audience. And then as individuals, I think something that we can do beyond kind of the talking past each other is, I think one of the best things about debate is or one of the more effective mechanisms in debate is trying to identify the strongest argument from the other side. And I think if as individuals we're able to somewhat kind of take maybe the seed, or kind of like you spoke to the seed of the individual's history and perspective, but maybe speak to the seed of the content or argument that's being made, and use tools like the media bias chart to, rather than forming a counter argument, say hey, I don't agree, but I actually thought that this analysis of that topic was interesting and compelling, and kind of encouraging each other to engage in maybe slightly more balanced or more thoroughly sourced information on the topic. I think is something that could at least help everyone to engage in stronger conversation that might break that junk food loop. Because I think that having friends and an echo chamber is maybe rewarding in some ways, but I think that constructive controversy and having strong conversations with the strongest arguments from both sides leaves people feeling even better than snippets and heavily biased or unreliable material.
Well, I think you alluded to something that I see bring people together in our work, which is getting more specific and granular rather than high-level abstraction, like snippets, memes, things that are like shorthand. They're like gratifying and agree with your side. The more granular you can get, the better you can agree, even with people who disagree with you. You can like get to the root of what the disagreement is. Here's how we see it, and this is like what gives me hope for the future, that like we can actually do this as a country, because I see it every day at my company. So how we rate news sources is we do rate them on an article by article basis. So we'll have how we do this is we have a left, a center, and a right leaning person politically sitting on a Zoom together. They have a bunch of articles to go through together on the Zoom, and then they'll all read it. So they all read it, they come back, they score it for bias and reliability, and then we show each other scores to them, and they talk about what they saw in the article that made it more or less left or right, opinion, analysis, fact, whatever. And then they resolve any discrepancies, but usually they're like pretty spot on. They're pretty close. You know, a left, right, center person can say this article was left-leaning opinion, or this was right-leaning analysis. Like they agree within a few points, right? And even when we talk about very difficult topics, this holds true. And we get into everything. We get into, you know, abortion and guns and immigration. And, you know, there are certain, you know, hot button topics. I think that like we have identified that, you know, the hardest topic to talk about is race, but it's one level of like abstraction away from the personal, because each one of these people is talking about the article. They're like, this is what I see in the article. It makes it more biased and makes it less reliable to me. And so they're able to have really constructive conversations and come to high levels of agreement, even though they're diverse politically. So to me, this is like the best of what America can be and do, right? But so how do we like scale that? Like everybody should obviously, you know, come work for Advantage Media and be an analyst and do this for hours a day, right? But no, we see it like even you know, we how we teach news literacy is like teaching students how to do this. You know, you're looking at media from all other sides and all diverse points of view and talking about it. It really breaks down this the filter bubbles. It really breaks things down into levels of granularity where people can have a very constructive conversations. And then even like posting the, you know, the chart on Facebook, that comment thread is uniquely not a filter bubble. You know, people comment on it because they're like, I disagree, or I totally think this is right. And but they're talking about like really specific ones, like, ooh, this source should be a little bit higher or lower or left or right. And then that, because it's really specific, leads to some like understanding, like people can actually be heard. They might start out with like, well, hey, I don't like this, but they're in earnest, like they want to be heard. And if you respond to them by saying like, well, this is how we came up with it, you know, these are the samples that we're looking at, what are you looking at, we actually do come to we really have good conversations on those threads.
Keith, any final remarks?
Well, one is I just want to really agree with Vanessa's point that there's actually hope to be found by digging a little deeper and more granular. And just a little more evidence to support Vanessa's point. On issues polarization, how much do average Republicans and Democrats agree or disagree on the issues? It turns out that the more concrete you get about asking about particular policy questions, the more overlap there are. On most issues, there's more than 70% agreement between average Republicans and Democrats. And generally speaking, not totally, but the more concrete you get, the more true that is. I'll give you one kind of compelling example. Surprise medical billing. Do Republicans or Democrats want to really make sure surprise medical billing keeps going? Right? There's not a Republican. We had thousands of Americans study a 30-page brief on surprise medical billing. There was no measurable difference between Republicans and Democrats' views. Not only that we shouldn't have it anymore, but of the 5 different bills in the Congress of, you know, which way is the best way to end it, there was zero difference between Republicans and Democrats. So I think that we are far less polarized on the issues than we appear to be. It's part of the media problem that it appears that way. The most extreme voices speak louder and longer than everybody else, and so they have an outsized impression. But the truth is, most of us are not nearly as polarized, so there is much more common ground for us to build on to get to a better place.
So Vanessa, let me ask you specifically, when we see all the conversation about Section 230 and what the role of platforms should be, what is the path forward on that? What is actually actionable, and how does this get better?
Yeah, so, you know, Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, for those that are not familiar, is passed in 1996. So, I mean, think about where we are in terms of the internet today and where in 2021 versus 1996. So it was a law that was created back then. And the whole purpose of it was to shield tech companies, essentially platforms, from being liable in the way that publishers are. So, you know, you can sue a publisher if as a person for like defamation, if they say something bad about you because they edit all their content. and they're responsible for what they put on their pages. Well, there were some early lawsuits at the dawn of the internet where people could post things on message boards, and people would post like rude things, defamatory things about other people, companies, whatever. And then there were lawsuits not against the the posters who said it, but against the companies. And the whole question was like, oh no, are these platforms going to be liable like a publisher would? Because, and the big concern from the internet companies and the legislators were like, well, we don't want them to be liable because then the internet won't be able to grow. So there's actually two ways in which Section 230 protects the platforms. They can't get sued for the content that their users post. They're not liable. And they are permitted to moderate, but they're not required to moderate the content, right? And so I think at the beginning, they thought, well, we'll allow them to moderate, and they will go ahead and do so. So this worked extremely well to protect the platforms. No liability, right? And so they were able to grow and flourish without like the fear of lawsuits, but and they do moderate, like there's certain things you cannot put on these platforms, but that bar is very low, and that bar does not include like misinformation, right? So now the problem is like, oh no, like there's no incentive for these platforms to moderate other than like public pressure, and it's like causing danger and real life violence and all of these things. So folks are trying to legislate or propose legislation to handle, to figure out like what to do about social media companies. But the problem is social media companies are just so different from every other type of institution. If you're trying to like make a comparisons like, well, they should be treated like publishers and you should be able to sue them like publishers. I mean, they're quite different. It's millions and millions of pieces of user content. It's not like the Washington Post that has like a few hundred that they create themselves, right? It's not like a utility. There's questions about whether it is a monopoly and lawsuits and things like that. So like the ways that you regulate newspapers and utilities and other things don't necessarily apply to these social media companies. And so Section 30 doesn't do anything really to rein it, just gives them a lot of freedom. I think because social media companies do really unique things, like they, with algorithms, it's not just like a public square where everyone is just allowed to say whatever and everyone has an equal chance. It's like they build megaphones for everybody. And if you get more attention, they'll build you an even bigger megaphone and a bigger platform and shove it in people's faces as they walk by on purpose and encourage them to go to your booth, right? It's like they funnel through algorithms for engagement, like specific speech and content to specific audiences. So they're not just passively just allowing people to communicate out there. They're like actively shoving certain content in people's faces. Because they're doing that, I think there needs to be a new regulatory framework, like, not Section 230, like new laws and regulations that address those particular problems and unique aspects of what social media companies do. So I think some of the what that would look like, actual regulation, if there was a political will to do so, would be requiring like labeling, choice, choosing your like filters, choosing like what you could, what's promoted to you and not promoted to you. If you think about like the GDPR and like the California privacy regulations, these are regulations that had to come up and catch up with the technology because there just weren't these problems that existed before. So a new framework like that, but for how social media companies moderate their content is, I think, what would be required. It remains to be seen whether like the US can muster up the political will to regulate social media companies like that. What it might look like is like there's so much pressure for regulation, and then eventually these social media companies effectively self-regulate. So that if you look at like content ratings for movies, PG, PG-13, those are not mandated, but there's like a lot of public pressure, and now they're like voluntarily adopted throughout the industry.
Very good. Bob, you got anything on that one?
Yeah, I mean, this is not my area of expertise, but what at all. So but listening to this, right, the thing that I think does connect, and I think about the role that Media Roundtable is playing or can play in this. If we talk about the way in which societies work, the way in which people kind of interact and order themselves, right? It's broadly speaking through the use of laws, and then through the use of kind of informal mechanisms, right, that happen. And what we know from research, it really started with Bob Alexson's, so he's a professor at Yale Law School, on order without law, continuing through work that my colleague at Harvard's Kennedy School, Iris Bonet, has done, is there are kind of two domains where you have kind of high compliance. One domain is when there is law with high enforcement, and the other is where there is little law but high trust. What you don't want to do is set up a regime of either law with low enforcement, or no law and no trust, right? And so if you think about the niche that Media Roundtable is arguably trying to play here, is to create a space where even though the larger ecosystem is relatively low trust, that people can feel that a container has been built that allows people to kind of work out some differences, engage in some tough but civil, fair-minded discourse, and work out arrangements for working together where they can continue to feel that their free speech rights are respected, continue to feel like they're heard, continue to feel like they're not in an ecosystem where if they say the wrong thing, they're canceled forever. But it's done by the development of containers, communication skills, and kind of trust building. And then, I see this other effort, right, which is that maybe in the larger ecosystem, we've evolved to a place where this is too big and too unwieldy, and there needs to be, as Vanessa is saying, the development of a legal regime that tries to take into a whole bunch of competing interests. And I think the key to that ultimately would be setting up a legal regime with very little teeth and very low enforcement might actually be worse than letting informal mechanisms kind of play out over time. But I think you could really design it probably really thoughtfully and well, and that's going to take a lot of hard thinking, as Vanessa says, a lot of political will, right? And the background, of course, in all of this, I think, is if that doesn't happen and things just get thrown to courts to figure out, courts are not expert on anything. And so, you never want a intellectual property dispute to actually make it into a court, because they don't understand. It's not like they just don't understand the intellectual property, right? And so then they're making judgments that are like really bad
right now.
There's a particular case called Alice from 2013 that just kind of is a bane of a lot of patent attorneys' existence because of a fundamental misunderstanding. Yeah.
So I just think the way of thinking about this is, right, there are some different ways of handling this through the use of law, proactively through the use of courts, or the creation of informal kind of mechanisms that can help create cultures of some increased trust and improved communication. And I guess that's where I see the Media Roundtable wheelhouse as being, right? Because no one here is in Congress yet, although maybe some of you will be at some point. So that's my thought on that.
There are so many people that are interested in this. There are so many people that I think will hear this and agree with everything that they've heard. But at some point, it takes a certain amount of courage and initiative to actually go out and do something with it. And so, just to wrap up, I just want to thank all of you for not only being here today and sharing everything that with us, but also for the work you're doing day in and day out, because it is courageous, it is thankless, is disheartening frequently, but it is vital and essential for our interests at home, at work, and for the country. So I think you've all provided really excellent perspectives here. And I believe that this is an important thing we're doing, and I'm just so glad that you're all on the journey together with me here. So thank every one of you.